Hello everybody, welcome back to the latest episode of Call Me Mr. Broadstreet. First of all, thank you for your continued watching of the series. I appreciate it. Again, if you haven't done so already, just hit that bell, give a thumbs up, and subscribe. Please tell other people about the channel. I always appreciate it. This week's review, I'm going to go ahead and review The Tomorrow Show with John, Paul, Tom, and Ringo. Now, this is the Tomorrow Show for Tom Snyder. For those not familiar with the show, it was a show that aired between 1973 and 1982. So Tom Snyder worked for NBC, and he had a whole bunch of guests, musicians, actors, various famous people. Usually it was done without a studio audience, from my understanding. And he also tried to make a comeback in the mid to late 90s, I think, with something called The Late Late Show, or The Late Late Show with Tom Snyder. That's kind of how I remember seeing some of his later work. Also, just to let people know that Dan Aykroyd used to do a really good impression of Tom Snyder in the old SNL days, way back during the first cast era, first 5 years. So, again, I'll show the DVD again. It's released by Shout Factory. So you get a nice little kind of yellow submarine-inspired design there. Get a description on the back, and don't worry if you can't read it. I will kind of read off the description from the insert cards and go through notes I took during each episode. I'm not going to hopefully go into too much depth, but just sort of some highlights I felt while watching the shows. Disc 1 has the John Lennon interview. So John Lennon tribute from the back here, as you can see. Have a nice little description of each episode. So I'll kind of just read through, so just bear with me with some notes and some reading here. John Lennon tribute, December 9th, 1980. This was the day after he was sadly taken from us on December 8th of 1980. So they also had rebroadcast an original interview that Tom did with John back on April 12th, 1975. For the December 9th tribute show, they rebroadcast the interview from 1975, obviously. They also had Lisa Robinson, who was with the New York Times and did, I believe, one of the last interviews with John Lennon, if not the last. I think one of the last. I don't think she did the very last. Jack Douglas was also a guest on the show. Jack Douglas, record producer. He had produced some of John's 1971 Imagine album, but more recently at that point, he had produced Double Fantasy in 1980 for John and Yoko. So he was the guest naturally that night, and you could tell people are shocked, obviously in shock, not even probably 24 hours after those sad events. A little bit lighter fare as we move on. Paul McCartney interview from December 20th, 1979. He was promoting his album Back to the Egg from that very same year. It's broadcast from London, so Paul and Linda, along with two other members of Wings, Denny Lane and Lawrence Juber, were interviewed for that clip. So Paul and Linda were getting ready. They were basically doing the 1979 tour of the United Kingdom as Wings, and they were getting ready for the concerts for the people of Kampuchea. It was basically like a disaster aid concert. That would actually take place, I believe, on December 27th of 1979 and run through just about the end of the year. So they were doing kind of that as a charity show, but that was on the tail end of their 1979 United Kingdom tour. Finally, in this episode, Ringo kind of gets the short end of the stick, so to speak, because he only gets about 25 minutes of the interview. November 25th, 1981, interviewing Ringo Starr, featuring the music video for Rack My Brain. That's off of Ringo's Stop and Smell the Roses album. They also do an interview with Ringo's wife, Barbara Bach. They're still together today, thank goodness. Actress Angie Dickinson, I've heard her name before, but she has no real Beatles connection, so that was kind of the shortest interview I rewatched. I've had the DVD since about 2008. I really enjoyed kind of rewatching the old interviews, just kind of that very vintage, shot on videotape look that was very prevalent, probably from about the, I would say the mid-70s, probably even to the mid to late 80s. You kind of saw that vintage videotape look. So I'm just going to go through a couple notes. Again, these aren't necessarily in chronological order, but just the order I rewatched them in. So real quick, first, the Paul interview. nice to have, December 20th, 1979 broadcast. They're doing Back to the Egg. They have the clip for the video Spin It On from the Back to the Egg album at that point. So, some kind of interesting, funny notes that I took, and if you'll indulge me, I'll just read through some real quick. Tom Snyder, the host, comments about, oh yeah, TV set HD from Sony of Japan, but they had to warn him about radiation from the set. So that was kind of funny. I thought just a funny little quip to begin the interview with. And it's funny to see that TV set actually does look pretty HD for the time compared to what we see on the DVD itself. The video quality probably isn't the best. Again, it's shot on videotape, and it looks like there's a couple little fuzzy lines and skips. I don't know whether that's because I've had the DVD for a long time or it's just from the original broadcast. The source material may not be good. So it's a little harder to scale. I'm going to get the obvious out of the way first before I continue that I'm not really necessarily ranking this as I would rank an album. That said, I think if you enjoy the Beatles and the solo Beatles interviews, definitely pick this up. Pick this up somewhere along in your collection. So getting back to the Paul interview, again, they start with the video for Spin It On. They have Wonderful Christmas Time as the kind of the bumper music in between some of the segments, which Paul had just recorded at that point, which we all get to hear every year. I personally love the song. I enjoy it. I know other fans, maybe not so much, but you know what? My show, I enjoy the song. So there you go. Tom kind of asks about the recent safety issues, particularly the Who concert. There was an open-air stadium seating Who concert in Cincinnati a couple months earlier in 1979, where sadly, I think either 7 or 8 people lost their lives, getting trampled from people just rushing into the stadium. So Paul just kind of comments on that a little bit, says, yeah, they have more orderly system, more entrances and exits for people to get through. They go a little bit into the genesis of Wings. They talk about how various members of Wings that they interview, joined Wings. Paul kind of goes into their first university gigs. This would have been about 1972, as he's thinking back on those gigs. And I'm going to cover those more in album reviews. Let's see. Basically, Linda gets some really good questions as well. How does being in a group differ from, her impressions of it growing up? She says kind of more of the pressures of being in a group. It's really nice to see Paul and Linda kind of interviewed together. I mean, it's been so long since we've seen, obviously, Linda, sadly, her passing back in 1998. I think she's missed. She's missed by the fans, and I think she was a very great presence in Paul's life as well. And had fate not been so cruel to her with her diagnosis, they'd still be together today, I'm sure, and still probably out touring or making music. These past number of years since she passed back in April of 1998. So basically, just kind of going through that. Some funny quips about. Paul, what did you do when, way back when you had groupies? He goes, well, I don't do that anymore. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Kind of some funny back and forth. Again, it's a lighthearted interview. It's probably the most lighthearted out of all the interviews here. I'm a big Paul fan, but I don't think this is the best interview on the disc. That I'll get to. I think we'll kind of go through some of the other stuff, but just real quick, they kind of go into what do you think about current situations about the economy, Iran at the time, the Iran hostage crisis. They say, hey, we're just as vulnerable as anybody else. We think about it, but another interesting question: what do you think of the future for your children? Linda kind of answers, hopefully less industry. She goes a little bit into her photography career as well. So at this point, she wasn't an active rock photographer, which is what she started off as. But she's kind of just going into, family snapshots, which have since been released all these years later in various books, a couple of which I have, which are really worth checking out if you enjoy photography. They do interview Lawrence Juber and Denny Laine, both the guitarists. Denny was the longest with Wings, going back from the beginning right to the end of the group. Lawrence Juber, he joined Wings around 1978. Denny Laine knew Lawrence, and of course there was a lot of lineup changes with Wings, so that's kind of where you get the whole turnover of most members. Paul, Linda, and Denny being the primary core members. They ask, how did you join Wings? Denny says, I just sort of auditioned. Lawrence kind of the same thing. He auditioned as well. Denny knew Lawrence Juber, who I think Lawrence is actually the best guitarist, pure guitarist that Paul's ever played with. If you don't get a chance, check out some of his stuff online. He's a really amazing guitarist. Again, I think as a pure guitarist, he's the best guitarist Paul has ever played with. And that's saying something, I know. But yeah, that's just my own personal take. In this segment, it's kind of nice that they interview other members of Wings, and we don't really get that in other official documentaries about Wings, particularly the Wingspan documentary from 2001, which again I will interview. There goes my brain again, which I will review at some point. Thinking of Tom Snyder and all the interviews. See, we're doing this on a $0 budget. What can I say? But anyways, that's the beauty of taping live, so to speak. Paul does get asked the obligatory Beatles question, but kind of in a unique way. Tom asks, well, do you get as wistful as the rest of us with the Beatles reuniting? Paul at the time said no, but of course, over years and years, I think all of their answers kind of changed depending on the time period you asked them and the day that you asked all of them, would the Beatles get back together? So I think his answer, probably how Paul felt at the time, but of course, I think eventually we would have gotten something close to the Beatles anthology. Anyways, I'll cover that in another review down the line. They do tell Tom, oh yeah, hopefully we'll get to touring next year. Unfortunately, the Japan January of 1980 bust kind of put a squash on those plans. Another little funny note, the director of this particular episode was named George Paul. I'm not kidding, you can look it up. So we get Ringo's interview. We get his interview from November 25th, 1981. Now at this point, it had been almost a year since John was taken from us, and that's kind of the core of the of this next interview. Ringo gets to talk a little bit about missing John, obviously. The interview is conducted out in L.A., so I'm assuming it's either Ringo's home out in L.A. or maybe a house they were renting out in L.A. He was promoting at the time his Stop and Smell the Roses album. Good album. I'll get to that in the future. His movie Caveman, I'll get to that in the future as well. His thoughts on turning 40, which was kind of interesting. One of Ringo's relatives asked, well, do you feel different that you're turning 40? And he goes, well, yeah, I don't think that, anybody 60 or older is considered old anymore. I'm kind of paraphrasing. That's not the exact words that were used, but I'm trying to give you an idea of that. His meaning of Stop and Smell the Roses, just to kind of take a look around, relax, enjoy life. I think that was very much, good perspective to have. This interview, you kind of notice a lot of interviews, he's wearing sunglasses throughout the interviews. This one, not really. He takes them out for a second, but he's mostly, you can actually see his eyes, which I just think is an interesting little take on it, because I'm used to seeing him with sunglasses in various interviews before this point, and definitely after this point as well. So again, these are just some of my observations kind of writing down. He gets asked, well, what changed in your life over the past 4 or 5 years? He goes, well, I stopped making albums. Well, not entirely true, but yeah, his last album had been in 1978, so about 3 years before this interview, which might have been a lifetime ago at that point when artists were releasing an album every year or two, like clockwork. Let's see. It's, so Ringo also mentions it's easy to work with Paul and George. He gets asked about that. Is it easy to work with them? He answers yes. Let's see here. Why the movie Caveman wasn't such a big success. One little funny phrase that they use, or sentence that he says, is that maybe it's not as good as Young Frankenstein, which a lot of people would agree, which the interviewer Tom is happy to point out, which is true. But also just kind of interesting to note, smoking cigarettes like chimneys throughout these interviews. It's not something you really see on TV anymore, but of course, got Tom, the host, lighting up, smoking away, and Ringo kind of lighting one up, smoking away. Again, not something you see now, so it's kind of an interesting little time capsule, I think. He kind of goes into other questions, the image as the dummy of the group that Ringo has, which, of course, he's a smart guy. John even says that in his interview, which I'll get to in a moment, or in a few moments. Ringo is definitely not a dumb person. It's just kind of a stereotype from Hard Day's Night. They had to make caricatures of each person, really kind of bittersweet. Ringo gets asked about the last time meeting John. Ringo says, well, Thanksgiving of 1980. So again, this interview from November 25th, 1981, you've got to figure it's been exactly a year at that point, roughly, since they had seen each other. So that was that was very poignant. Nice, very poignant moment. He gets asked about the same thing, Beatles reunion. Ringo says, a lot of people didn't talk to them about it, talk to the individual Beatles. People would just say it to get their name in the papers or on TV or on radio at the time. He also just says about the Beatlemania show, getting asked, well, is it like seeing you guys up on stage? Ringo's answers, not really, we lived it, something along those lines. He gets asked about the origin of the Ringo name, because he wore a lot of rings. I think a lot of the more hardcore fans out there, and even more casual fans listening to this, seeing this, the story already. Wore a lot of rings, he was seen around there. Just another interesting question. If in a jam at 3 a.m., who would you call? Ringo lists off a couple people. Paul and George are included in that. Harry Nilsson, who was sort of a musical contemporary of both John and Ringo during the 70s. He gets asked about the future. Ringo says, well, hopefully doing another album, which, yes, he would. An oldies cover album in 1983 that was not released in the United States or Canada, called Old Wave. Also wanting to start a production company with fine cigars, etc., that him and Barbara would, do. Well, they didn't actually end up doing that. I'll put it that way. I don't think they ever started that fine production company. It just probably sounds like one of those nice ideas at the time. Probably as multiple streams of income. But a lot of celebrities do it today. You see it with fashion lines, you see it with movies, music, all sorts of different things. So, with you bearing with me on this review, thank you so much. And we finally get to John. John Lennon's interview in this set is worth the price of admission alone. I think it's the most poignant interview. I really think it's the core of the set. I think if it had even just been a John interview, just the John tribute, I would have automatically bought it. And again, I'm a Paul fan, as you can see. I mean, he is my favorite solo Beatle, but I've got to give credit where credit is due. John's interview is the best. It's the most insightful. It is 100% worth the price of admission. So just sort of some notes with this to wrap up some of my thoughts on the DVD. So, again, it was rebroadcast December 9th, 1980, as I said at the top of this review. It hadn't even been 24 hours since the tragic events of the day before, or the evening before. The interview itself, it's from April of 1975, so April 25th of 1975. John's going into kind of his retirement mode, kind of his 5-year exile, if you will. Although in retrospect, because of the Lost Lennon tapes, there was a Lost Lennon tapes series back in the late 80s and early 90s. John was actually working on demos. He was still recording songs. He was still writing stuff on guitar, piano. He just wasn't publicly releasing it. So we kind of get the official story of the guitar hung up on the wall from John during that time, but really, he is creating music. It's just for himself. He's not under contract. He's busy taking care of his son, Sean. Yoko's running the business. She's running the entire financial business and everything from the first floor of the Dakota. John is on one of the other floors of the Dakota. I think the 8th floor is where they lived on, in one of their apartments, taking care of Sean. So kind of a role reversal, but very much, I guess, ahead of their time. John was tired of being on the treadmill, and Yoko was very, very shrewd in a lot of investments and decisions she made to make them money. Not to mention, of course, I'm sure, royalties from John's Beatles and solo work up to that point. So he gets asked about, Beatlemania. At the time, John's kind of rocking more of a White Album look with the round glasses and kind of long hair to his shoulders. Tom Snyder, the host, mentions that he was at a 1965 Philadelphia concert for the Beatles, kind of covering that earlier in his radio career. John kind of says, well, it was, what it was like to be with the fans. He said it was kind of like at the eye of a hurricane. So he's reflecting on Beatlemania about 10 years after the fact. He does say they broke up out of boredom, although not quite sure I'd buy that as the whole story, but I get what he means, that maybe the music wasn't as creative as it once had been, but there were a whole bunch of other factors. One very funny line is Tom, the host, is saying, oh yeah, well, who are these guys with these silly haircuts? John shoots right back at him, goes, you're working on yours right now. Because Tom's hair is kind of swept forward, kind of Beatles style, kind of mid-70s Beatles style. So I just thought that's kind of funny, a funny little line of John. It just shows how much he was missed. His witty, right there. Oh, you've got one too. You're working on yours right now. He gets asked about groups advocating social change. John said, well, the Beatles weren't really part of that, but they did have some subliminal messages they would send out, kind of with all you need is love and things of that nature. And there definitely were more probably hidden messages. I think the single Revolution might be the most overt social commentary the Beatles had made. That song from 1968, the single version at that point. But they were never overtly political. Not as much as John would get in his solo career. So were there groupies before the fame? Well, yeah, of course there were. They had their fun. The certain people would hang around, certain groupies would hang around and go with anybody. So it's kind of just a funny little back and forth between the two. John does go into the fact that they spent a long time together as a group, that he had been with George and Paul way before 1964. Paul and John meet in 1957. George joins the group, I believe, in 1958. I'd have to double check my dates, but they'd been together a long time before they were even on the Ed Sullivan Show. And Ringo joined later in 1960, so they'd been together quite a while. He just kind of also gets asked, what music do you like currently? John says, disco, reggae, those type of things. So he's saying what he currently liked at the time in 1975. That's kind of on the charts, as it were, along with rock music and everything else. He's asked, does music go into cycles? And John says, yeah, in a way it does. Here's an interesting question that I like from the interview. Sadly, John did not get to see 1988, although, ironically, the movie of John Lennon's life did come out in 1988. So it's kind of a weird little universal trick why the host picked that particular date. I don't know. But he goes, okay, so someday in 1988, this is Tom's question, there's going to be some new group with a sound reminiscent of the Beatles. John says, yeah, well, there'll be new instruments that groups have, but it's all going to have its roots in rock and roll, or roots going back maybe even further to the 20s. So I thought that was just kind of very insightful commentary, from him in the interview. Let's see. Also, Tom just asked, what did they do with their social activism? How did they get involved in that? Both John and Yoko, well, they say, well, we did the bed-in, 7 Days for Peace. So he kind of goes into that. It doesn't cover a lot of new ground in that respect. Kind of one of the maybe sadder questions is John getting asked, do you get harassed when you're on the streets of New York? He goes, no, I can go anywhere. We as a family can go anywhere and grab food and everything. And it's kind of sad him being asked in 1975 about that, given what would happen. And that kind of permeates the more the tribute parts of the interview as I'm getting to that. So we kind of get to that end of the 1975 interview, and then we skip right to the December 9th kind of tribute portions. So it's about 20 minutes of the video that's on the disc here. So basically, Tom just pokes fun at the fashions of his former self back 5 years earlier. Thought that was kind of funny. They go into a couple different people that they have on. Lisa Robinson did one of the last interviews, as I mentioned at the top of the video. John just talks a lot about his house husband years, as I've mentioned before. He shows Lisa some of his memorabilia. She goes, I have a certain piece of memorabilia. He goes, I don't have that. She sent it to him. I think it was a tray that she sent to him of original Beatles memorabilia. So John was just as much of a fan of the Beatles as everybody else, whether he wanted to admit it or not. So that's kind of good. Tom, the host, asked, well, are celebrities now concerned about their security after what just happened? And, of course, that's kind of hanging in the air, not only in the immediate aftermath, but now you see celebrities at an event. I'm sure there's 4 or 5 bodyguards standing close by. Given, sadly, what some certain fans, and I'll put it in quotation marks because you're not a fan if you're going to hurt somebody. You're just not. That's just not good at all. So just really wrap things up, Jack Douglas also gets interviewed again. He's the producer from Double Fantasy. Just says that John was looking forward to the 80s, to something being a more positive time. He was happy about the success that he was having. And during the original interview, John gets asked, well, is everybody happy with the solo success? And he goes, well, I think we're all happy for Ringo's success as a solo artist. And at that point, Ringo was still kind of riding high on the charts. So I thought that was just a very, very nice answer. And it just showed, I think, how much love they all had for each other, even despite the business differences and despite the fact that they would talk to each other and occasionally visit each other. But, the whole Beatles monster, as it were, wasn't exactly present in their lives anymore. But it just goes to show what a deep bond they all had. So that's really it for the, again, for the Tom Snyder set here. So again, I'll just show you once more with the DVD itself. So again, pick it up. I think it's really insightful. I think it's really good if you're a retro enthusiast in general. But it's more specifically if you're a Beatles and solo Beatles fan. So I think until our next episode, I don't know when that's going to be. I know we have the Hurricane Henry, however you want to pronounce it, bearing down on the East Coast. So hopefully we'll have power in a few days. I don't know. But whenever I see everybody next, I just hope everybody's staying safe. And again, thank you for watching and for listening. And please feel free to comment below. Is there anything you remember from the Tom Snyder interview? Anything you remember from that era? Or from any other similar interviews between, say, the mid-70s to the mid-80s? I think those would be good to hear in the comments. Any suggestions? I'm always happy to take them as well. But thank you so much, and until next time, I'll see everybody later.